A young girl without power, no family, no nationality, no place to call home. She was brought into the palace like an object to adorn the empire's power. But when an entire nation was about to be wiped out, she, the one forced to stay silent, was the only one with a voice before the throne. The astonishing secret of Esther, the woman who changed her name to survive but could not deny the destiny appointed by God. A genocide decree was issued. Welcome to Prayer Station. A royal ring sealed the death of an entire people, but that girl did not tremble. Some callings don't come as a voice, but as whispers in the soul, when you know if you don't speak up now, there may be no chance to survive. Esther didn't just step into the palace, she stepped into destiny. She wasn't chosen to beautify the throne, but to kick open the gates of fate with trembling yet honest courage. You once thought, I'm too small. You once felt, big things aren't for me. But if someone were in your position, in a moment of life and death, then maybe you are the very answer God has been waiting for. But before Esther was crowned queen, before she donned the royal robe and entered the inner court, and before the bold declaration, if I perish, I perish, there is one more important thing that must be told. Something forgotten amidst debates over beauty and the crown. Something no one has told you about her origin, about people living in exile, about an unfulfilled promise, and about a stream of history in which Esther, though just an orphan girl, stood right at the center. The story doesn't start in the king's palace, but at a banquet where another woman refused to bow. This is not just a biblical fairy tale. This is a question of destiny. And you, will you choose to remain in the shadows or step forward like Esther? Watch to the end. Because what comes next won't just take your breath away. It awakens the very reason you were born. In an empire where gold was laid beneath the king's feet, and a woman's name could be erased with a single nod, there was a Jewish girl. Orphaned, landless, nameless, with nowhere to call home. Her real name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle tree, a small flower often found growing along the Jordan River, a name carrying the scent of homeland, memory, and hope. But when taken into exile in Persia, that name was too dangerous to keep. People began calling her Esther, meaning star. But what kind of star can shine in a sky that no longer belongs to her? Esther grew up under the roof of Mordecai, her cousin, whom she called father, not with power, but with whispered lessons in the night. Do not forget your people. Do not forget the God of our ancestors. Among the voices of the Persian Empire, Esther learned to stay silent, but never forgot who she was. No crown, no outstanding beauty, no status. Only a faithful heart. And a faith like smoldering fire, never extinguished. Then one day the king's decree was announced. Gather the most beautiful virgins from all 127 provinces to select a new queen. Esther, the hidden Jewish girl, was taken into the palace. No one knew that among the dazzling crowd was one whose identity was considered shameful. 12 months of refinement with oils, cosmetics, and royal protocols. But what drew attention to Esther? It wasn't perfume, it wasn't makeup, it was her humble gaze, her gentleness not born of this place. Her silence carried an unspoken strength. Then came her turn to enter the king's presence. No extravagance, no calculation. She simply brought what Haggai the eunuch advised her to take. And something strange happened. The king looked up and his heart skipped a beat. Not because she was the most beautiful, but because something nameless had entered the room. Esther was crowned. She became Queen of Persia, but still could not reveal she was Jewish, because the time had not yet come for destiny to be revealed. Maybe you're living with a name that isn't yours. In a world that doesn't accept your past, doesn't care where you come from. Maybe you've forgotten who you once were, or never even knew. But if Esther could hide in the shadows, just to wait for the moment God would bring her into the light, then so can you. Because there are stars that don't appear in the daylight. They only come out when the night is dark enough, and when destiny speaks. But outside the city gates, the wind is starting to rise. A decree is about to be signed, not to choose a queen, but to erase an entire people. And Esther's adoptive father, Mordecai, is about to step into the heart of the storm. Not with a crown, but with sackcloth and cries in the middle of the square. Esther had been crowned, but destiny had not yet begun. Because sometimes the throne is not the destination, but the doorway to a life or death choice. Will a woman who once hid herself dare to rise when an entire kingdom trembles? The next part will be when Esther faces the greatest calling of her life. Will she risk her life for those no one else wants to save? When a queen dares to say no, the whole kingdom trembles. Vashti, the woman who refused to appear before the king during a wine banquet, shook the empire from India to Ethiopia. And to prevent a wave of rebellion in households, a decree was issued. Find a new queen, more beautiful, more obedient, easier to control. But this beauty contest was not as simple as it seemed. Behind the perfumes, gowns, and makeup was a spiritual battle in disguise. From all 127 provinces, hundreds of girls were brought into the palace, living under a harsh beauty regimen for 12 months. Half a year with oil of myrrh, half a year with cosmetics. Being chosen didn't mean being loved. They were standardized property made to fit royal expectations. Among that sea of women was a girl named Esther. No title, no power. No one knew who she was. Only Mordecai, who raised her as his own, knew that behind the name Esther was Hadassah, a Jewish orphan living in exile. Esther asked for nothing. She didn't request extra jewels, didn't choose the most lavish robes. She simply took what Hagar, he king's eunuch, advised her to bring. Among the hundreds vying for attention, Esther remained silent. She didn't compete, yet drew attention. Didn't embellish, yet made every eye stop. When her turn came to meet the king, Esther didn't know destiny was shifting. King Xerxes had seen thousands of dazzling faces, but he had never seen someone like her. Not because of beauty, but because of a light that radiated from within. In that very moment, the crown was placed on the head of a Jewish girl whose identity the king did not know. A girl from a forgotten people. A girl with no power except faith and heart. Esther became queen, not because she was good at beautifying herself, but because God saw what no one else did. In a court that chose based on human standards, God was chosen by the heavenly ones. And while the throne sought outward beauty, he was still seeking a heart willing to carry out his plan to save his people, right in the heart of an empire filled with shadows. But there wasn't only light in the palace. Outside, another darkness was beginning to take shape, a man rising in power, but also rising in hatred. He didn't care for beauty, didn't want a crown. What he craved was submission. And one man's refusal to bow to him was enough to spark a genocide. While Esther wore the crown on her head, A death decree was being written. She didn't yet know she was about to step into a battle fought not with swords, but with prayer, and a decision that might cost her life. In an empire stretching from India to Ethiopia, where every whisper inside the palace could shape the fate of a people, a man began plotting murder. Haman didn't hate an entire people. At first, he only hated one man. That man's name was Mordecai, a common Jew sitting at the king's gate with no power, no influence, but with one thing that made him stand out. He did not bow. While everyone else knelt before Haman, the man King Xerxes had just promoted to the highest royal position, Mordecai alone remained standing, silent but unbowed. Haman's pride couldn't tolerate that blemish, a silent defiance, a simple act. But to a man with an ego that large, it was a slap in front of the crowd. Haman didn't just want to punish one man. He wanted to erase an entire people. A decree was drafted, cunning, calculated, and laced with venom. He convinced the king that there was a group in the kingdom that was different, disobedient to the king's laws, and a threat to the empire. The king didn't know it was the Jews, and he didn't ask. He simply removed his signet ring, the symbol of ultimate authority, and handed it to Haman. Just one seal, one royal signature, and destruction was scheduled. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, across all 127 provinces, from plains to deserts, from capitals to countryside, every Jew would be killed. Children, the elderly, women, all of them. Not because they did anything wrong, simply because they belonged to a lineage Haman couldn't control. Blood would run in the streets, families would be torn apart, and the cries would go unheard. Esther still didn't know. Inside the palace, she was still queen, but outside the walls, her people were condemned. A silent verdict, no screams, no defense. Mordecai heard the decree. He didn't scream, didn't riot. He simply put on sackcloth, covered his head with ashes, walked through the streets with red eyes and slow steps. He couldn't enter the palace. Anyone wearing sackcloth was forbidden from stepping into the king's presence. But he didn't need to enter. He only needed Esther to hear. He sent word to her, a message short but shaking to the soul. Don't think that just because you're in the king's palace you will escape. And who knows, perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. And now, all eyes turn to one person, not the king, not Haman, but Esther, an orphaned girl, now wears the crown of an empire. She stood between two gates, one, personal safety, silence, anonymity, the other, death, for approaching the king without being summoned. She had no prophecy, no angelic visit, no miracle, only a people waiting and a burning question in her mind. If I stay silent, will anyone survive? Night fell, and the palace buzzed with life. But in Esther's heart, a battle had begun. A battle where sometimes the bravest one is not the strongest, but the one willing to lay down her life. She had no weapons, no army, no protection from the title of queen. Because in the Persian court, even a queen had no right to enter the king's chamber without being summoned. Esther knew that law well. One wrong step, death without a verdict. It had been 30 days since the king last called for her. She had once been crowned, but now, that crown wasn't enough to save her from the strict laws of the palace. In that moment, Mordecai sent a message unlike any other. Do not think that you will escape just because you are in the king's palace. If you remain silent, deliverance will come from another place. but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. For such a time as this. That phrase cut through the night like a sword through fear. Not because she was strong, but because she had been placed in the right place at the right time to confront the darkness. Esther had no time to hesitate, nowhere left to hide. She made a decision not with logic, but with faith. Go, gather all the Jews in Susa, fast for me 3 days, 3 nights. My maids and I will do the same. After that, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. A vow in the dark, a decision with no return, a small voice in the heart louder than the decree of an empire. Esther began to fast, put away her makeup, set aside the royal robes, no longer the queen of Persia, but a daughter of God, preparing to walk into the thunder of destiny. Night 1, no answer. Night 2, silence still hovered. Night 3, all remained dark. But when dawn broke, Esther put on her royal robes, not to be praised, not to be admired, but to do what was right, even if it meant death. She walked toward the great hall. Before her stood the throne, and upon the throne, the one man who held the power of life and death over her. She stood there. No one spoke, no one breathed, even heaven seemed to hold its breath. Until the golden scepter was extended. One gesture. But that single gesture opened the door to a great story of redemption. But the battle wasn't over. She didn't step into the palace to seek life for herself, but to begin a plan. Wisdom would precede even prayer. Esther knew. She couldn't enrage the king, couldn't confront directly, and couldn't lose his trust in a game of destiny. She didn't choose haste. She chose patience. A banquet would be the veil for an accusation. A second feast would be the moment heaven's wrath would speak through a woman's mouth. Because when the righteous stay silent, darkness will reign. But when the righteous speak, even the throne must tremble. And Esther spoke up, not before the crowd, but in the highest seat of power where truth had long been buried beneath wine and beauty. Now the banquet would become a courtroom. The one who thought himself the greatest would hear judgment from the one thought to be the least. Esther stepped onto the throne, not to sit on it, but to awaken an entire empire with silence and resilience. She didn't rush to beg, didn't let fear control her actions, and didn't lose the position God had divinely appointed for her. Instead of storming in with arguments, she invited the king to a banquet. A banquet not to fill the stomach, but to stir up questions. A royal table not to entertain, but to set a spiritual trap. The king agreed. Haman, her enemy, was also invited. He entered with pride, thinking he was being honored. He had no idea he was sitting in the very seat where his fate would be judged. At the first banquet, Esther simply served. She said nothing, revealed nothing. She simply let the king's curiosity soak in like wine through the veins. The king asked, "What is it you desire? Even up to half the kingdom I will give it." Esther just smiled and invited him to yet another banquet. She knew a plea holds the most power when offered at the right moment. Meanwhile, Haman returned home with a sky-high ego. He boasted to his wife and children, "I am the only one the queen invited to dine with the king. No one else received that honor." But his joy was shattered by one thing. Mordecai still sat at the city gate and still did not bow. Haman's rage ignited like fire. He ordered a gallows to be built 75 feet tall to hang Mordecai upon it. But he didn't know that gallows wasn't meant for the righteous. That night, The king couldn't sleep. An invisible unrest stirred his heart. He had the royal records read aloud and discovered that Mordecai had once saved him from an assassination plot, yet was never honored. At the very moment Haman came to ask for Mordecai's execution, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king wants to honor?" Haman thought that man was himself. So he painted a glorious scene, dressed in the king's robe, riding the king's horse, paraded through the city as a symbol of honor. The king said, "Excellent. Do just as you said for Mordecai." And Haman, the man who plotted genocide, now had to lead the horse for the man he wanted dead. He didn't know that was only the first reversal. A second banquet was waiting to unveil the truth. Another banquet is coming, no longer a place to raise a glass, but the place where a nation's fate will be decided and a man's heart exposed. Esther would no longer remain silent. She would speak, not as a queen, but as a voice for an entire forgotten people. The banquet would become a courtroom, and the place Haman thought would honor him, it would become the very place he would be unmasked. Heaven was orchestrating a reversal, unexpected, unstoppable. When God prepares to overturn an evil plan, he doesn't need thunder, just one word from the woman he chose. Haman woke up that morning thinking he was the man favored by heaven and earth. He had just left an exclusive banquet with the king and queen, a privilege granted to no one else. Pride swelled in him like wine overflowing a silver goblet. But one small thing made it all feel meaningless. Mordecai was still sitting, still not bowing. Back home, Haman raged to his wife and friends about the humiliation. He immediately had a gallows built 50 meters high, not to hang a man, but to hang all of his hatred for the world to see. The next morning, he planned to ask the king for Mordecai's immediate execution. But that night, another king couldn't sleep. Ahasuerus tossed and turned, not because of wine, not because of luxury, but because of something he couldn't explain. "Why is my heart uneasy?" He ordered the royal chronicles to be read aloud, and among the pages detailing forgotten acts of valor, he discovered a story long overlooked. Mordecai, the man who once saved the king from an assassination plot. "What reward did he receive for this?" the king asked. "None, Your Majesty." At that very moment, Haman entered, about to request Mordecai's execution. But the king spoke first. "What should be done for the man the king wishes to honor?" Thinking the king meant him, Haman painted a glorious image. Royal robes, the king's horse, a parade through the city declaring honor. The king nodded. "Perfect. Do just that for Mordecai." Haman froze. Before he could say a word, he was ordered to lead the man he hated most through every street, under the watchful eyes of the entire city. The crowd shouted, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." But in Haman's heart, the glory had rotted like the wood on the gallows he built. He returned home, humiliated, defeated, without a word of defense. Right then, palace guards came to summon him to the second banquet with the queen. The final banquet had arrived. The king again asked, "Esther, what do you desire? Even up to half the kingdom it shall be granted." Esther lifted her head, eyes glistening, voice trembling but unwavering. "Grant me my life and the lives of my people." The king was stunned. "Who is he? Where's the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther pointed without hesitation. "This wicked man, Haman." In a flash, the king's face darkened. He stepped outside. His royal fury simmered like fire beneath stone. Haman lunged to beg Esther just as the king returned and saw him fall near the queen. "Would you assault the queen in my palace?" No more chances. Haman was hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. The reversal had come, not from man, but from the Almighty, the one who overturns every scheme and restores every buried honor. No one could revoke a Persian decree. But God, who is not bound by human law, wrote a decree far higher, a decree that needed no king's seal but was signed with justice and mercy. The 13th of Adar, once scheduled to be a day of genocide, became the day they rose, allowed to defend themselves, allowed to live. Everyone waited to count how many Jewish corpses would fall after the slaughter. But it was the schemers themselves who ended up digging their graves. And in that scene, where funerals turned to festivals, where mourning gave way to joy, a woman stood silently behind the palace curtain. She held no sword, wore no armor, but she was the reason a nation survived. Her name was Esther, and that story, it's not over yet. In human history, some days will be erased from memory, but there are also days etched into the soul of a people. The 13th day of Adar, once meant to be a day of bloodshed, now became the day when the Jewish people lifted their voices in song. Not because they were too strong, but God chose to stand with those who seemed weak. Across the provinces of the empire, the Jews held feasts. No one could fully grasp the meaning of that joy, because that joy didn't come from food or wine or garments, but from the sigh of relief after a death sentence was withdrawn, from life after preparing for death. And then a festival was established, not by a king, not by the temple, but by those who had survived. The Feast of Purim, commemorating the day the Jewish people were delivered, commemorating that woman, Esther, who wasn't born to be queen but was placed on the throne for a purpose greater than herself. Gifts were sent, tables were set, stories were told to children that God is still at work, even when He doesn't appear in miracles. He never forgets His people, even when they are in exile. That someone who seems nameless, powerless, if willing to obey, can alter the course of history. God's name is not mentioned even once in the book of Esther, but He is present in every detail. He walks in the shadows, He moves the heart of a king. He breathes life into a woman forced to hide her true name. And He writes an epic, not with angels, but with a person who dared to rise at the right time. That day, Esther no longer hid herself. She was no longer a Jewish orphan girl in a foreign land. She was a woman remembered forever, not for power, not for beauty, but because she chose to step in when silence was the safer choice. And today, where you stand, may not be a throne, but it could be such a time as this. For you to rise, for you to speak, and for you to become the deliverance someone else is waiting for, just as Esther once was. The ending doesn't stop here, because the story of Esther is not just a story of the past. It is a call to the present, to those who dare believe that God can use them, even if small, weak, or unknown. Now it's time to enter the reflection, to understand why this story is not just a fairy tale but a vision. Purim is still celebrated to this day, not as a dry religious ritual but as a reminder to every generation that God never forgets. No one thought an orphan girl could shift an empire. No one imagined a hidden woman in the royal court could save the people from extinction. But that's exactly how God writes history, with those no one expects. Esther lived in a time without prophets, without visible miracles, only faith in the dark, and she became a miracle. But what if Esther wasn't born for that by accident? What if you, the one reading or hearing this right now, are you also living in such a time as this? Because maybe it's time we look at the whole story again, not just as an ancient record, but as a prophecy knocking at the door of our generation. Not once throughout the entire story is the name of God mentioned. No miracles, no fire from heaven, no prophetic voices echoing. Everything seems silent. Yet in that silence, a divine plan was still unfolding. Every step Esther took, every word Mordecai spoke, every banquet, every sleepless night of the king. All of it orchestrated not by chance, but by a sovereign God still directing history from behind the veil. Esther was not a prophetess. She had no miracles to her name. She was just a young woman, once an orphan girl, nameless, living among an exiled people. But she carried something every person of God needs: obedience in the dark. This is not just a story about a queen in the Persian Empire. It is a reminder to each of us that there will be times when you don't see any sign from heaven, don't feel called, don't hear a clear voice. Only circumstance, only danger, only a decision that must be made. And that is when you realize that you were placed in that exact spot at that exact time, not to live comfortably, but to step in. Not to stay silent, but to rise. Not to protect your position, but to save someone else. Esther is a picture of the church today, a body that seems silent in a chaotic world. But in truth, it is being called to act when everything right is under threat. Esther had no sword. She had no army. She had only one thing: the courage to believe in a plan bigger than herself. And that was what saved the people. If a Jewish woman in a foreign empire could do that, then maybe it's our turn. Maybe it's time to rise. Maybe it's time to place ourselves into such a time as this. And maybe you are living in that time. You don't need a throne. You don't need a crown. You just need a heart that dares to say, "If I perish, I perish." Because somewhere amid this generation's crisis, God is still searching for someone willing, a new Esther. And maybe you are living in that time. You don't need a throne. You don't need a crown. You just need a heart that dares to say, "If I perish, I perish." Because somewhere amid this generation's crisis, God is still searching for someone willing, a new Esther. You don't need a throne to be used by God. You don't need royal blood to change history. You just need a willing heart. Esther never sought the crown. She simply obeyed at the right time. And that saved an entire people. You are living in such a time as this. It's no accident you are here. It's no coincidence you are hearing these words. Maybe you are the Esther for this generation. Maybe you're the only one who can rise to change something wrong, whether in your family, your community, or the spiritual world. Don't stay silent any longer. Don't doubt the position God has placed you in. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, I don't wait for more miracles because I am the miracle you created. Use me as you used Esther, so I may rise for what is right, even if it costs me everything. Even if I must say what no one else dares to say. Grant me courage from heaven to not live in silence when you have chosen me for this time. In Jesus Christ's name. Amen. If you feel God stirring something inside you, don't hold it back. Don't let this fire go out. Share this video right now with someone who feels invisible, with someone who needs to know God has never forgotten them. Leave a comment if you're ready. Like this video to say you've heard heaven's call. Subscribe to Prayer Station so you don't miss a single revelation being released for this generation. Because the time has come, and God is calling Esther to step out of the shadows.